Details of an explosive new report by Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz about the origins of the FBI's Russian probe getting leaked to the press today. The Washington Post came out with a bombshell about it, writing, quote, "The Justice Department Inspector General has found evidence that an FBI employee may have altered a document connected to court-approved surveillance of a former Trump campaign advisor." But then the Post says, but it is concluded that the conduct did not affect the overall validity of the surveillance application, end quote. Now, the advisor mentioned is thought to be Trump campaign foreign policy advisor Carter Page. Here's what Mr. Page said earlier today to Maria Bartiromo. Listen.
There has been a continued cover-up to this very day. We still don't have the truth, but hopefully we'll get that soon.
And here now is former prosecutor Andy McCarthy. He's author of Ball of Confusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. So, Andy, if an FBI lawyer is altering a FISA application to spy on a U.S. citizen, that's heavy stuff. How could it not affect, quote, the validity of the surveillance application?
Well, there's a doctrine of law, David, that when you have a warrant, if there's false information that's been presented by the agents, whether it's intentionally false or it turns out to be false, what you do is you look at the rest of the presentation that was made to the court, shorn of the tainted information or the false information, and if the rest of the information is enough to make out probable cause of whatever you have to show, then the warrant is still deemed to be valid. Even though the information, you have this tainted information. So I assume that's what they're talking about. What I'm interested in is when they talk about the validity of the application, what exactly do they mean by that? Because the narrative that I see that seems to be starting to be promoted, and it's telling to me that these leaks are coming from CNN and the Washington Post, where they have very good sources among the people who are under the microscope, so to speak, in this investigation. The narrative I think they're starting to project is the FBI's real premise here was that Russia interfered in the election. And as long as they were right about that, if it turns out they were wrong or did some irregular things in connection with the investigation, they still got the bottom line right. And to my mind, that's half the story of what the FBI's premise was. Nobody disputes that Russia meddled in the election. The question is, did they have a good faith, compelling reason to believe the Trump campaign was complicit in Russia's cyber espionage activities? And if so, why? What was that evidence? And that's what we need to get to the bottom of.
Andy, I hear what you're saying from a legal perspective, but I also wonder if this doesn't sort of set the stage for, okay, the FBI can make things up, go around spying on whomever it would like, as long as it doesn't really, impact the final outcome of something. I mean, there's a problem with that logic, right?
Well, yes, in principle, there's a problem with it. But in terms of a longstanding doctrine of law, the fact of the matter is, it is true that if only a portion of a warrant application turns out to be false, but the overwhelming amount of it still makes out probable cause, that's been the law for, decades. With this, I think the issue is going to be, let's say we have this misconduct. We have whoever this low-level FBI person is who meddled with or who tampered with a document. If it turns out that that's just a sliver of what they had, then, it's probably fine. But I don't see how it could be, because the real issue that is vacant from any of the coverage we're seeing is the Steele dossier, we know, was substantially part of the probable cause for this warrant, and yet we know that was not verified, and a lot of it is just wrong. I've pointed out that another big piece of the probable cause was they talk about the Russians trying to recruit Carter Page between 2008 and 2013, and they leave out the inconvenient facts that Page cooperated with the FBI in the investigation, and they used his information to prosecute the Russian spies. So it seems to me that we have a lot of reasons to be suspicious about the probable cause information that they gave the court.
But Andrew, I kind of wonder, like, if we ever looked over all the FBI's work with this level of scrutiny, I wonder if there'd always be a lot of, like, flubbing things and getting permissions to do stuff. And then when you've magnified that they actually thought the Russians, well, they were doing that, influencing the election, that's from the FBI's job, that's got to be like, we got to do everything we can to figure what's going on. This is like the number one thing, like, and they would just, these kind of things are going to happen in the government. I wonder if it's really that rare for the FBI to do this. We just don't know of all the times in the last 150 years, I should say, that this was going on.
Yeah, well, you've hit on something that's a very serious consideration here. The world that I came from, where I was a prosecutor for almost 20 years, the FBI is subjected to this kind of scrutiny in every case, because in criminal cases, everybody operates under the knowledge that the information that gets generated in the investigation, even though you don't have to, there's obviously no defense lawyers there when you go get a warrant from a court, but eventually there's going to be discovery, there's going to be sunlight, everybody's going to get to see it. The problem with counterintelligence is there's nobody there except the FBI, the Justice Department lawyer, and the court. And none of this is ever supposed to see the light of day. And the thing we need to worry about is it doesn't have the same kind of incentives that keep you honest as the criminal system does. And what I think we need to worry about is this a regular thing in counterintelligence? That is, when they're operating under circumstances where they don't think anyone's ever going to check their work, do they take these kind of liberties?
Andy, real quick, President Trump calling for the Senate to hold an impeachment trial. Listen to this.
We couldn't have any witnesses.
Great.
We want to call the whistleblower. But you know who I want as the first witness? Because, frankly, I want a trial. I could have it.
You want a trial?
Whatever I want. Oh, I would. Look, number one, they should never, ever impeach.
Is it a good idea? Andy?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent idea. If he knows that he's going to be impeached anyway, the only position I think publicly he wants to take is that, all right, finally, now I'm going to have my public trial where I get to put in all of the evidence and my defense of the case that Adam Schiff wouldn't let me put in. And by then, I get to put in the Biden-Burisma stuff. I get to go into the Ukraine collusion with the Democrats in the 2016 election. And if everything lines up right for me, by the time we get to my trial, I'm also going to have all this stuff from the Inspector General investigation into FISA abuse. So, yeah, sure, I think he wants a trial.
Andy, it's interesting. I agree with you. I think the trial probably will be a good political thing for the president, in particular because the Republican Senate will conduct the trial. You said one thing that's pretty interesting, though, that the president would want to put the Ukraine, how did you put it, the Ukraine meddling with the U.S. elections into the trial. I kind of doubt he wants to do that since that didn't happen.
Well, no, there's two theories of Ukraine collusion, which were also confused in yesterday's hearing. There's the cockamamie discredited theory that he talked about with Zelensky, that the Ukrainians were the ones who hacked the Democrats and therefore the Russians didn't do it. Nobody credible believes that. There's no Republican in Congress who believes that.
And quick,
on the other
number
hand,
two.
there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence that Ukrainian officials colluded with Democrats to hurt Trump and help Clinton in the run-up to the election. And don't take my word for it. There's a Ukrainian court decision at the end of 2018 that found that officials meddled in the American election.
Andy McCarthy, always a pleasure to see you, Andy. Please come back soon.